I'm going to be talking about HR 891, the Energy Resilient Communities Act. So on the agenda for today, we're first going to be talking about what is the environmental problem that the bill is addressing. Secondly, we're going to talk about what is the solution that the bill is proposing. And then third, we're going to talk about are microgrids a feasible solution to this problem. And then last, we're going to talk about how we could measure the bill's success if it were implemented. So what is the problem the bill is addressing? Let's first talk about Texas here. In 2021, they experienced a deep freeze that engulfed the entire state and put millions out of power, resulted in 249 people dead, and energy bills skyrocketing. And then in Texas, a year later, as they had the same problem happen, another 279 deaths, and also skyrocketing energy bills. And then right now, having the exact same problem amid another heat wave with increases up to 800% in energy bills. And they also just broke the record for energy demand at 89,000 megawatts, and they'll probably break that record again later this week. So disasters such as these becoming increasingly more common with climate change. And in 2020, there was 1.3 billion outage hours in the US total, which was a 73% increase from 2019. So how do we address this? The bill addresses 4 key problems to solve this. First, there's an excessive concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere as a result of fossil fuel consumption. This has created these types of storms that we're seeing in Texas. And then secondly, we have low energy resilience to these storms. Our grid is at risk for outages and energy insecurity with these storms becoming more common. Third, there's a lack of energy democracy. There's not much community ownership of the grid, which reduces decision-making in how our energy works. Then lastly, there is a lack of community security. Without heating, cooling, and functional medical facilities during these weather events, human life is put at risk. So let's first understand how the current grid system is inefficient and also unresilient in the face of these storms. So it relies on centralized energy production from fossil fuels and long distance transmission of energy. But over these long distances, energy is lost due to congestion, transformer losses, and resistive heating. This is expected to get worse as temperatures warm, about 7% more inefficient with climate change. These long distances and outdated infrastructure is unresilient in the face of these increasingly more common and more intense weather events. So who is impacted most? And it's really everyone. Anyone that uses energy in the US from the main grid is at risk here of these outages. But particularly people of color, low-income groups, and those receiving critical care medical facilities are particularly at risk. They're disproportionately affected. According to the EPA, Black and African-American individuals are 40% more likely to be in areas where there are the highest projected increase in temperature-related deaths. They also experience high levels of pollution, are more energy insecure, and spend more money, a higher percentage of their income on their energy bills. So what solution does the bill propose to address this? So the bill allocates $1.5 billion in annual grants for clean energy microgrids to build resiliency. Within that, at least $150 million is allocated towards community-owned energy systems, which goes back to addressing the lack of energy democracy in our communities. And there's an additional $50 million towards annual grants for technical assistance. But within this, applicants from environmental justice communities are given higher levels of funding and also priority as they experience disproportionate levels of risk. So what are microgrids? Microgrids are more of a decentralized approach to the grid. Within that, they rely on, they can be what's called islanded and sectioned off from the main grid when needed. And then in that situation, they would rely on energy produced on the grid, as well as controls and storage systems, which can make them smart grids. When they are islanded off and rely on their own grid, it can be clean energy, it could be fossil fuels. Predominantly, microgrids do use fossil fuels at the current time. As of 2022, about 10% of clean energy, there was 10% of microgrids used clean energy, but by 2025, they expected to increase by 35%, or to 35%. So we interviewed Dr. Mohammed Shahidapur. He's the Associate Director of the Wenger Institute of Sustainability Energy Research, And he said that when we talk about smart grids, it's not really the grid that's getting smart, it's the people that are using the grid that are getting smart, which really highlights how we should be, approaching our grid more with more innovative solutions rather than it's not necessarily innovative technology. It's I think about the grid more innovatively. But so, are these a feasible solution? In terms of scale, the small scale allows for more efficient generation of power because energy is not lost over these long transmission lines. Additionally, they are more resilient because they can be sectioned off or islanded from the main grid, reducing the potential for outages. And then they also have a technical complexity that is an advantage here. There is monitoring systems, modern battery storage, energy modeling usage that is used in these microgrids that so that they have these technical component that gives them an advantage here in more efficient load processing. But this is also kind of an issue because it is expensive. So right now it uses grants to fund this. And then in the future with higher demand for these types of technologies, the price will come down. But in general, at a larger scale, there is economies of scale for microgrids. When we look at them on an industrial site, it is about twice the price per megawatt hour than when we use them on a community level with higher numbers of users. But there are some regulatory questions here. The differing permitting laws vary from state to state, especially because a lot of this has not been explored in terms of regulation. And then particularly the line that interconnects the microgrid to the main grid is usually owned by the utility company, which complicates the ability to potentially sell back surplus energy to the main grid. But there's also a question of the availability of resources. This affects the feasibility as well. This will vary from location to location. In a desert, it might be more preferable or more feasible to use solar panels, whereas on a coast, it's more feasible to use wind turbines. But this really goes into approaching each microgrid individually. You have to engage the community and see what works best for the community. I mean, is there a nonprofit that's going to do the management of this microgrid, or is there state laws that will dictate how that would be done? These can have to approach again each individually. But there are some scientific issues that are often raised when we talk about microgrids. People are often afraid of technology. First is how green are these green technologies? Solar panels, wind farms, these do require high capital input and high ecological inputs as well. In a sense, they're financially and ecologically expensive. But in the lifespan of these technologies, they are cheaper in terms of emissions, and there is potential that some of these technologies can be recycled in the future. People bring up land. Do we have enough land for renewables? It really just comes down to using your land more efficiently. It's using rooftop solar rather than a giant field of solar panels, or solar to shade areas rather than, again, a giant solar field. There's also storage capacity, which can be limited in certain situations. In an urban environment, this might be a difficult consideration, is where do you put that storage? How does that affect the residents? There's also cybersecurity threats that are often brought up. But in reality, a microgrid is actually more resilient to cybersecurity attacks because, once again, it can section itself off and island itself from the main grid, protecting it from outages that affect the main grid. So how would we go about measuring the bill's success? Firstly, through reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We need to show measurable reductions in greenhouse gases, as well as increased use of renewables. We need to show, secondly, increased energy efficiency through improved generation efficiency, which means generating more for less, less loss of energy through transmission, as well as a reduction in the price of energy bills. We also need to show increased grid resiliency, fewer outages, through smart monitoring, the number and length of disruptions to the grid, as well as reduction in response time to outages on the grid. So if you don't remember anything from today, there are 3 key takeaways. First, extreme weather events lead to longer and more frequent outages, and this particularly affects environmental justice communities, but it does affect everyone as well. Secondly, microgrids do enhance grid resiliency because they can section themselves or island themselves from the main grid, and they can reduce emissions when used as a clean energy microgrid. And then finally, this bill, HR 891, funds this microgrid technology, and it prioritizes environmental justice communities that face a disproportionate level of risk. Thank you to the whole team and our advisor, Stephen Cohen. Any questions?
Great presentation. I'm actually very cheered by this last picture showing solar on warehouses. And I was wondering whether the bill particularly targets that rather than arable land, farmland for these microgrids, or does it not get into that granular level?
So it doesn't really get into that granular level. It's application based. So I think they would evaluate each application individually, and they prioritize environmental justice communities. So most of the ones that exist are more for like hospitals or like I think NYU has their own, so it's more of like a campus kind of design. Industrial sites use them a lot to keep the energy on. So are they used for communities? Was your question? Sorry. They're kind of dispersed, so it really depends on like where these like industrial and commercial sites are.
Yeah, I was just wondering how are environmental justice regions being prioritized, one, and then two, what is the funding and where is that being pulled from for those areas?
Where are the environmental justice communities from?
No, how exactly are they being prioritized? Like, do you know what the mechanism is for identifying them? Is it the
Yes.
EPA's? Yeah.
So assuming they're already identified or when they do apply, I think they would apply like this is a community that has faced disproportionate levels of risk historically and is also in danger for higher levels of potential climate events. So I think that's kind of how they would look at it now. I think they've identified these environmental justice